morning. Our hearing will come to order. I want to thank all our witnesses, my dear friend Dr. Ehlers, and the members of the audience for being here. This is the third hearing we are having in a series of meetings dealing with the issue of international scientific collaboration and what some have called scientific diplomacy, the idea that scientific exchanges can go a long way towards not only advancing science itself, but advancing international relationships. Both Dr. Ehlers and I are very passionate about this, both of us trained as scientists, and having had the privilege of meeting people from around the world who have been impacted by collaborative exchanges, we place a high value on this. In the past, we've heard from government agencies, and today we will hear from 3 non-governmental organizations that engage in scientific diplomacy and from a university that supports research and education partnerships, not just across southern borders, but halfway across the world to a country and culture radically different from our own, and we look forward to hearing about that. As important as it is for the U.S. government to actively engage in science diplomacy, the organizations that we are having with us today represented here add unique value to the effort. They are widely known and respected throughout the world. They represent the best of U.S. science and higher education, and they have the flexibility, the connections, and the know-how to engage scientists and pursue good science even in countries where government-to-government relations are tense or limited, and in countries with limited S&T capacity of their own. I had an interesting brief chat with Dr. Leshner earlier about, for example, the challenge in some cultures of producing non-significant results. If that's a failure experience and failure is not allowed, goodness gracious, how do you do science if you can't fail? Well, I often emphasize the diplomatic benefits of international science and technology cooperation. There are also many compelling reasons for the U.S. public and private sectors alike to make S&T cooperation a national priority. Visit any of the high-tech enterprises in my district and I'm sure across the country, and you will see they are indeed international endeavors, and bringing people here, sending our people internationally is an often, I think, unseen benefit of collaboration. The major challenges faced by our nation are the major challenges faced by the entire globe, and our country cannot effectively pursue solutions on its own. So look forward to hearing from this very distinguished panel of witnesses about their efforts to promote international science and cooperation, as well as their recommendations for how the federal government might strengthen its efforts through more effective partnerships with U.S. scientific organizations and research universities. I will tell you a brief anecdote which others have heard before, but I think it's so compelling that I will tell it often here, and it is of visiting Egypt a couple years ago at an international meeting and meeting a young woman with a headscarf, actually not young woman, she was probably in her late 50s, and a headscarf, kind of classic Arabic woman, and when she was introduced to Howard Berman and he said he was from Southern California, a proud fist shot into the air and the woman said, "I am a mighty Trojan." She had gotten her doctorate at USC, and she didn't just say, "I got my doctorate at USC," she had become a mighty Trojan. And that kind of affection and sincere warmth one doesn't take lightly, and it is through scientific collaboration, I think, that much of that is achieved. And so we look forward to our witnesses today, and with that I recognize Dr. Ehlers for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, my apologies for being a bit late. We were trying to solve the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac difficulties in the space of 15 minutes. That would have been easier to solve Maxwell's equations. Today's hearing gives us an opportunity to learn about efforts by non-governmental organizations and universities in science diplomacy around the world. The federal agencies have a responsibility in this area, of course, as we learned in a previous hearing, but many of the organizations before us today are uniquely positioned to leverage their own strengths at building relationships in science and technology cooperation that transcends literal and figurative borders. Even in times of governmental conflict, relationships built on trust and mutual respect will outlast current frictions. One of the advantages of being older is to remember this has all happened before. And I remember during the years of the Iron Curtain, things of that sort. The two things that contributed a great deal to the breaking down of the Iron Curtain were exchanges of cultural activities, primarily musical, but there were some other cultural activities too. And that broke the ice But I think what really did make major contributions is the interchange of scientists between the Soviet Union and the West. Both parties were, both American scientists and the Russian scientists were very anxious to work together. They did not regard this as a political activity, but the net effect on the government of Russia, I think, was to open the doors even wider because they could learn from us, and they did. This committee knows that the U.S. will not remain globally competitive in science and technology unless we are able to work with international partners. Utilizing all avenues to strengthen these relationships, public and private, official and non-official, will be critical to our success as a nation. Raising the profile of science and technology is a consistent goal of this committee as well. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about both their successes and challenges. I certainly appreciate your attendance at this hearing, and I'm sure we will learn a great deal from you, the experiences you've had, and I can add those to the experiences that I've had working directly in my laboratory with foreign scientists whom I still keep in touch with. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. At this time, I'd like to introduce our distinguished witnesses. First, Dr. Alan Leshner is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for Advancement of Science and Executive Publisher of the journal Science. Dr. Leshner, I would like to say I received your letter. I will be renewing my membership just next week. I truly did. It was in my mailbox last night that my membership to Science is about to expire, so it's on the way. The check is in the mail. Dr. Michael Clegg is the Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Clegg is also Donald Bren Professor of Biological Sciences and of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California at Irvine. Dr. Bill Wulf is member of the Board of Directors of the U.S. Civilian Research and Development Foundation. Dr. Wulf is also AT&T Professor of Computer Science at the University of Virginia and immediate past president of the National Academy of Engineering. Dr. James Calvin is the Interim Vice President for Research at Texas A&M University. Dr. Calvin is also Professor of Statistics at Texas A&M. As the witnesses all probably know from experience, our spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, but after that we'll have a nice positive exchange of ideas and questions. We'll start then with Dr. Leshner. Again, Doctor, thank you for being here.
Good. Thank you very much, Dr. Baird, Dr. Ehlers. First of all, thank you both for your membership. We enjoy your participation in our organization. I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for holding this hearing and giving us an opportunity to speak about the critical role that U.S. non-governmental organizations can play in international science and technology cooperation. Just to be clear, the American Association for the Advancement of Science is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society, and in spite of our name, we are in fact international in membership and character. About 20% of our members come from outside the United States. Our international activities typically support two key objectives. One is to helping to build and knit together the global science enterprise, and secondly, promoting what's called science diplomacy. We at AAAS believe it's incumbent to our mission to build international partnerships that assist other nations as they are becoming integrated into the global science enterprise. We also help developing nations establish the requisite scientific infrastructure so that they may better reap the benefits of science for their societies. Science diplomacy has as its goal to utilize international scientific collaboration to foster communication and cooperation among the peoples of diverse nations and to promote greater global peace, prosperity, and stability. I'd like to draw a somewhat subtle but I think important distinction between science diplomacy as conducted by governments and science diplomacy as often carried out by non-governmental organizations. Governments often use science and technology as a diplomatic or foreign policy tool, either to help foster another country's development or to increase understanding of U.S. values and ways of doing business. As used by non-governmental organizations, however, science diplomacy typically has been used to maintain communication and cooperation links among the citizens of countries when their governmental relationships might otherwise be strained or limited. Because we believe science diplomacy to be particularly important at this point in world history, I'm very pleased to announce today that we at AAAS are creating a new AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy. The center's overarching goal is to use science and scientific cooperation to promote international understanding and prosperity. It will provide a forum for scientists, policy analysts, and policymakers to share information and explore collaborative opportunities. I also would like to take this occasion to offer some suggestions about steps the government might take to better position the U.S. in undertaking international science activities. First, we need to raise the profile of these issues, and I'm particularly pleased you're having this hearing. We need to raise the profile to the government, to the public, and to the scientific community itself. I do hope that other congressional committees, particularly those dealing with foreign relations, will work jointly with you to continue the discussion through, for example, additional focused hearings. As just one example of a topic, a hearing might be to look at the mechanisms the State Department could use to evaluate more effectively the science and technology cooperation agreements that the U.S. has with other countries, particularly in terms of their follow-on activities and their long-term impacts over time. We also believe that there are steps that might improve the effectiveness of the international programs of U.S. governmental research agencies. One concern I've long had is that some agencies are limited by statute in what they can do because they're not allowed to pay the costs for foreign participants. We believe this limitation can impede the ability of the programs to achieve their overarching goals. In the realm of science diplomacy, I would encourage Congress and the State Department to consider developing funding mechanisms that could be used to catalyze the types of international science cooperation that are consistent with and reinforce U.S. foreign policy objectives. And finally, I believe that any efforts to raise the profile and effectiveness of international science require strong White House leadership, particularly through a presidential science advisor with sufficient rank to work across the entire government. The Office of Science and Technology Policy must also have an associate director who has a clear international mandate if this is going to work. As science and technology are ever more embedded in every aspect of modern life and in every major global policy issue, it's essential that we determine ways and places where science and technology cooperation might be better incorporated into international relations, not only government to government, but critically civil society to civil society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leshner. We've been joined by Mr. Bilbray from California. Thank you, Mr. Bilbray, for being here. Dr. Clegg.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss international science, technology, and health cooperation. I'll use the abbreviation STH to refer to science, technology, and health. I am Michael Clegg, Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences is a merit-based organization that elects outstanding scientists to membership and includes the nation's scientific leadership. The U.S. Congress chartered the Academy in 1863 with the explicit mission of providing STH advice to the U.S. government when asked. Now, I'd like to address your questions directly. Why do the academies promote international science cooperation? Science is a global activity, was a global activity long before the invention of the term globalization, because the advancement of sciences and the issues and challenges of STH programs are predominantly global in nature. Science is increasingly transborder and global in its conception, exploration, and application. It is thus in the vital interests of the U.S. science community and more broadly U.S. society to maintain close linkages with science communities throughout the world. Mr. Chairman, we believe that our organization, together with its sister academies, the National Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Medicine, and allied science NGOs like the AAAS and major disciplinary science societies, bring unique strengths to international science cooperation. Let me illustrate this point with 3 case studies. Beginning in the early 1980s, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences established a standing committee on international security and arms control that worked with scientists in the Soviet Union and later in Russia on issues of nuclear stability, arms control, and nonproliferation. The initial work was aimed at building mutual trust and respect, but ultimately this effort matured into a dialogue that was central to later arms reduction agreements. Current work with the Russian Academy focuses on topics such as the international nuclear fuel cycle, international nuclear security environments, and beyond cooperation with Russia, we convene dialogues with India on Indo-U.S. cooperation and international security issues, and we convene a series of U.S.-China engagements on security-related questions. Let me now turn to a second example, that is creating bridges of cooperation in areas of conflict. We have an ongoing program of cooperation with the Academies of the Middle East. This effort included a project on water futures in the Jordan Valley conducted jointly with the Israeli and Palestinian academies and with the Higher Council of Jordan that resulted in a joint report entitled Water for the Future. This work has now matured into a series of joint activities that include projects on micronutrient deficiencies, water resources, renewable energy, pollution, and land degradation, and science education. An organization has been created to implement these programs, provisionally named the Association of Middle Eastern and U.S. National Academies of Sciences. Why are the U.S. academies seen as effective conveners of activities in the Middle East? The principal answer is that the U.S. scientific community is held in high esteem by all the societies of this conflicted region of the world. This respect for U.S. science institutions is based on widespread admiration for American accomplishments in STH fields, and it opens doors that might otherwise be closed. The third example comes from Africa, where 5 years ago we initiated a program of institutional development funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to build the capacity of African science academies to provide independent, evidence-based advice to governments and countries with an emphasis on health needs. The principal objectives of the initiative are to help academies establish sound advisory processes and to foster and sustain a relationship between the academy and its government. What are the unique strengths of academies? First, the high esteem accorded U.S. science by the rest of the world. International polling reveals that attitudes towards U.S. science are more positive than towards any other aspect of U.S. society. This attitude is especially pronounced in Islamic countries. Second, the academies represent the leadership of U.S. science and as such represent the human face of U.S. scientific achievement. This enables engagement and cooperative work aimed at shared goals in all regions of the world. Another strength is that the academies and other non-governmental organizations such as the AAAS can mobilize the U.S. scientific community on urgent issues. And third, and perhaps most importantly, is the ethic of science. Academies represent a scientific approach to problem solving, achieving national economic goals, and peaceful competition. A major aspect of our international program is to strengthen education and training and to empower science communities to be more effective in engaging national policymakers and the public, thereby transmitting this problem-solving ethic to other societies, especially in the developing world. How may the federal government take better advantage of science and the U.S. scientific community? The U.S. federal government has great influence in the world owing to the scale of the U.S. economy and owing to the widely admired egalitarian ideals and aspirations of U.S. society. This provides substantial leverage to achieve constructive solutions to global problems. Unfortunately, the U.S. has not always made full use of these assets. The U.S. has allowed its investments in international STH to decline. Take investments through USAID as an example. An Academies report published in 2006 and undertaken at the request of the USAID administrator found that STH competencies in USAID have declined substantially. The report makes a series of recommendations on how to rebalance the USAID competencies in STH to increase the effectiveness of USAID programs. A very positive step has been the creation of the Office of Science and Technology Advisor for the Secretary of State, and the naming of that same individual as advisor to the administrator of USAID. In its May 2007 strategic plan, the Department of State and USAID established an important set of realistic STH diplomatic strategies. However, these must be seen against inadequate on the part of Department of State or inadequate and declining on the part of USAID STH capabilities. Many of the leaders of science in other parts of the world have had significant experience in U.S. research institutions as students or as research visitors, echoing a point made by Chairman Baird. Those with direct knowledge of our country and its culture are frequently willing partners for further engagement owing to positive feelings about their experiences with U.S. science institutions, specifically in U.S. society generally. Regrettably, the cadre of international scientists with direct knowledge of the U.S. is declining. The reasons are many, but two are visa policies that inhibit applications to U.S. institutions and dramatic erosion of broad-based U.S. government programs for international fellowships. The Academies report cited above found that there has been a more than tenfold decline in the number of USAID-financed graduate students from developing countries at U.S. universities. The report makes a strong recommendation that USAID revitalize its investments in human resources based on historical experience. It is clear that a modest investment in fellowships will bring large returns to future generations. Now, I see I'm running out of time, so let me just summarize the last couple of points. One is that many federal agencies, USAID, EPA, have science programs with international dimensions, but they could benefit from more explicit instructions and advice from the Congress on how to implement those international responsibilities. Let me just then conclude by saying that major opportunities to capitalize on U.S. strengths are ignored. To assure a better future, we must make effective use of all of our nation's assets. Modest investments in international science diplomacy can leverage the enormous asset represented by the U.S. STH communities.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Civilian Research and Development Foundation, aka CRDF. I am fairly new to the board of CRDF, having just joined in February. I was quickly recruited to become chairman of the audit committee, and so I have immersed myself in the organizational, financial, and programmatic activities of the organization. An organization, I must say, whose mission I believe very deeply in. Nevertheless, let me introduce Kathy Campbell, behind me here, who is the CEO of CRDF and who will bail me out if I get in over my head during the Q&A. It's especially appropriate for CRDF to be testifying here today since it was the brainchild of the former chairman of this committee, the late George Brown. Chairman Brown was an articulate advocate of the for international science and engineering research collaboration, and he understood the value that that collaboration had as a tool to advance U.S. foreign policy and national security. In the early 90s, when the Soviet Union was disintegrating and engineers and scientists in the former Soviet Union's weapons laboratories were not being paid, there was a deep concern that those scientists and engineers would offer their services to governments that do not have the best interests of the United States at heart. Chairman Brown's first charge to CRDF was to fund these scientists and engineers to convert themselves to civilian research. I'm glad to report that that particular mission is mostly been accomplished. Chairman Brown's truly clever scheme not only kept the weapons designers at home, but helped enhance their civilian research capacity in contributing to the increased stability and prosperity of Russia and other members of the former Soviet Union. The success of the original CRDF mission underscored Chairman Brown's broader vision and what a lot of us believe deeply, namely that science and engineering can be a powerful tool for fostering better international relations. But there is much, much more to do. International collaboration in science and engineering is a twofer. Number one, it solves important human problems and thus contributes directly to security, prosperity, and health. But number two, it also creates those personal relationships and trust that engender peace. Based on that philosophy and our experience in Russia, the mission of CRDF is the promotion of peace and prosperity through international science and engineering collaboration. Scientists and engineers, I believe, are an extremely valuable but underutilized resource for U.S. foreign policy. As Mike just mentioned, according to numerous polls, the single most admired aspect of the West among Muslims is our technology prowess. We can and we should exploit that admiration. CRDF is a almost unique organization. It's an independent 501c3 not-for-profit corporation, but it was created by the U.S. Congress to advance U.S. foreign affairs and national security. We think of CRDF as a do tank as opposed to a think tank. We are implementers of things. We implement good ideas to encourage collaboration between U.S. and foreign scientists and engineers. Our unique specialty is to quickly and efficiently implement international science and technology collaborations based on merit and implemented with transparency, flexibility, and accountability. The success of the original charge from Chairman Brown also underscored that just giving out research grants wasn't enough. There's a whole infrastructure that supports research and increases the probability of collaboration opportunities for U.S. scientists. That infrastructure includes things like peer review for merit-based awards, the ability to write proposals, grant administration, logistics for joint research, and on and on. Those are all things that we take for granted in the U.S. research system, but in fact are not present in many foreign systems. So CRDF had to create that infrastructure. And so now CRDF's activities fall into about 20 programs, certainly support for research collaborations. This fall we'll be announcing a competition for research on climate change, non-proliferation activities, sort of the original mission from Chairman Brown. For example, we have recently managed to change what was a bioweapons laboratory in Siberia into one that is monitoring for avian flu in Siberia. Do program support, for example, logistical support for joint research between ourselves and the Russians in the Arctic. We do training on things like bioethics, on how to do peer review, on research management, grant administration. We have a number of activities related to institution building. For example, in most parts of the world, basic research is not done in universities as it is in the United States. We happen to believe that supporting basic research in universities is both good for the research and good for the universities, and so we have undertaken activities to, particularly in Russia, encourage that activity. We, as CRDF, did that at 20 universities. The Russians were so enamored and appreciative of that, they have done it by themselves in 15 additional ones. We're also focused on innovation and knowledge transfer. We have a program called Next Steps. We have created technology transfer offices in a number of universities. As an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization, CRDF has capabilities that complement those of government agencies such as NSF. For example, CRDF can move quickly and flexibly to respond to opportunities that arise. It can fund foreign research scientists and engineers to collaborate with their U.S. counterparts. It can seek and negotiate cost-sharing programs with foreign governments and multinationals. It offers potential overseas partners potential overseas partners a U.S. entity that is not part of the U.S. government, a property that is especially important in those countries that are suspicious of the intent of the U.S. government. Examples of all of these are given in the written version of my testimony, but it's just one example. CRDF has secured $43 million in cost sharing from foreign governments on 675 projects in 10 different countries. Recognizing the value of these complementary capabilities, CRDF has been tasked by a number of U.S. government agencies, including the Department of State, NSF, DOD, the Department of Energy, and the National Institutes of Health. Again, examples of the kinds of tasks we do for these are in my written testimony, but for example, the Department of State has been our principal funder of original work in Russia and the former Soviet Union. CRDF also stays in close touch with other NGOs, such as those here today, but especially the National Academy of Sciences and the AAAS. We each have unique strengths to contribute, so by working together, we maximize the quality of our international activities. In summary, I would emphasize 4 points in my testimony. Number one, science and engineering diplomacy can be a powerful tool for communication with influential citizens of countries that have limited or strained relations with the United States. Second, scientists and engineers share a set of values that transcend culture. Those shared values facilitate developing the trust that is essential to achieving U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives. Third, science and engineering NGOs, such as those here today, provide complementary capabilities to those of the U.S. government to further effectiveness of science and engineering diplomacy. Finally, CRDF's special contribution is as a do tank, that is, an implementer of science and engineering diplomacy activities and programs. We do whatever it takes to make those programs effective.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ehlers, and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be representing Texas A&M University and testifying about the role of non-governmental organizations in universities. Texas A&M has a long history of supporting the threefold mission of research, teaching, and public service, and globalization of research and education is a natural extension of this traditional mission. Through globalization, Texas A&M has been able to produce graduates that are better prepared to compete within the global marketplace, recruit top-level faculty, and leverage local and national research support, while at the same time further developing a positive international reputation. To support these numerous international exchanges at Texas A&M, we have over 130 active international memoranda of understanding and are currently in the process of formalizing nearly 30 additional MOAs. Of note is our branch campus in Doha, Qatar, where we offer 4 undergraduate engineering degrees with graduate programs soon to be established. This campus is supported by the Qatar Foundation, and so no taxpayer or tuition money is used to support this effort. Significantly, the curriculum requirements are the same as in College Station. Thus, undergraduate students must complete 6 hours of American history and 6 hours of political science in order to graduate. The workplace and the scientific landscape have become increasingly global. No country can maintain a monopoly on scientific discoveries or on a trained workforce. Thus, it is incumbent upon universities such as Texas A&M to engage this global environment so that we can lead instead of follow. Employers of our graduates tell us that they want employees with global perspective. Providing international experiences to over 46,000 students is difficult if we only limit ourselves to sending students to foreign locations. Having more than 4,000 international students on our main campus allows Texas A&M a significant opportunity to create global experiences for a broad set of students within the College Station environment. A unique example of this involves the current president of Panama and former student of Texas A&M. As a result of the Panamanian president's experience, he has promoted increased student and faculty exchanges with Texas A&M as a mechanism to help increase competitiveness of Panamanian universities. Scientific discoveries come from all over the globe. In many cases, these efforts are most effective if they involve global collaboration. Although we have relationships around the world, we have chosen to focus particular emphasis on 3 regions: the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. Here are some selected examples of such partnerships and their benefits. We have an agreement with Mexico's National Council of Science and Technology, or CONACYT, which is their equivalent of our National Science Foundation, that was formally established in 2002. Texas A&M and CONACYT have invested over $2.2 million in 93 new collaborative research teams involving investigators from both Texas A&M and Mexico. In fact, the partnerships are only funded if they are equally supported by both Texas A&M and Mexican researchers. And they cover topics of interest to both Mexico and the United States, from cross-border land and water use changes to diabetes and cardiovascular disease to electric energy by alternative renewable resources. Texas A&M, the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation, and the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries have hosted 3 China-U.S. relation conferences that have helped expand academic and business opportunities and strengthen one of our most important global relationships. Through this conference, Texas A&M is helping to promote continued dialogue at all levels and encourage the development of strong partnerships in areas of joint interest. Our campus in Qatar provides us with a remarkable opportunity to provide help in producing an increased engineering workforce in the Middle East, while simultaneously providing research opportunities to work on problems of global interest. During this past year, Texas A&M University Qatar faculty received grants from the Qatar National Research Foundation for approximately $12 million to pursue research topics in engineering, the physical sciences, and mathematics, all on topics that are of equal interest to Texas and the United States. Our new Institute for Applied Mathematics and Computational Science is a partnership with the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, or KAUST, located in Saudi Arabia. Through this $20 million effort funded by KAUST, Texas A&M faculty will be working on problems that are of fundamental importance while simultaneously helping to establish a new higher educational institution built on the Western educational model. The Institute is part of a global research alliance that currently includes only 3 other centers located at Stanford, Cornell, and Oxford. Finally, Norman Borlaug, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Congressional Gold Medal, is a distinguished professor of international agriculture at Texas A&M. The Borlaug Institute is assisting other nations to combat world hunger through technical innovations, training of agricultural scientists and workers, and intellectual leadership. There are currently 15 Texas A&M personnel serving throughout Iraq, working in cooperation with USAID, USDA, and DoD. In addition to what is said previously, there are 3 areas of interest that I think are quite significant in the way that universities can support the efforts of Texas A&M and all universities. The first, as has been mentioned before, is the visa process. While national security issues are clearly a high priority, efforts to enhance appropriate international intellectual exchanges still need to be encouraged. An important way the federal government can provide unique support is through the development of new programs that effectively provide joint funding for international collaboration. Many partnerships can be initiated through a number of local capabilities, but to move the successive ones to the next level of progress, we really need funding that is able to provide resources, as was previously mentioned, to partnerships regardless of their location. This includes support for American students wishing to study abroad, as well as the international research efforts that I've discussed. And if these resources can be made available, The funds for the international research efforts should be committed for the long term so that investigators can make a commitment required to make important advances in these new programs, and so that our international collaborators know that they can depend upon our participation as they develop and commit their share to such a funding model. And finally, we believe it's important that as we begin these new initiatives, scientific peer review is the driving force behind the allocation of resources. It is through the competitive processes that we've developed as a country that the best science can be performed and given into the most effective hands. Thank you.
Thank you all for outstanding testimony. We much appreciate it. We'll now begin the questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and we'll follow by Dr. Ehlers. We've been joined by Dr. McNerney from California. Dr. McNerney, thank you for your service on this committee. I want to begin by addressing, we heard from a number of you, the issue of visas. This committee's had a hearing on this, and the good news is that we are told that visas are improving. The bad news is there's still a lot of challenge, both in terms of the reality of whether they're being processed quickly enough and also the perceptual realities internationally about the difficulties people face, where we've had both hearings publicly here but also private meetings with a number of people from our various Homeland Security and related departments, and we're continuing to work on that. Points well taken, and we're working on that. On the issue also, I want to begin also by congratulating you, Dr. Leshner, on the Center for Scientific Diplomacy. It's and we're honored that you would announce that here, and perhaps you've announced it elsewhere, but it's
Oh, today's the day.
Is
This
that
is
right?
the moment.
It's perfect, and great minds think alike, I guess. And I can't think of a better organization to do that. And we'll look forward to good things from the center. In any way we can assist in that, we'll be happy to, and to celebrate your accomplishments. You also mentioned, Dr. Leshner, the importance of Foreign Relations Committee. Howard Berman is quite interested in this issue. We've had a number of conversations with he and his staff. They've been sitting in on meetings, and our hope is really to kind of set the table here through this series of hearings we've been having, and then work very in close concert with Chairman Berman and also with Nita Lowy. They both appreciate the value of this and have some great staff working on this issue, and we're eager to work with them on that. I want to ask a few questions, if I may. This issue repeatedly mentioned in your testimony about the restrictions on U.S. funds to go to foreign researchers. A couple questions emerge. One, we have the Fulbright program, predominantly to bring folks here, but do we need something like that where we would fund foreign researchers in their home countries with U.S. dollars? Not necessarily, you don't want to necessarily dilute the NSF monies, but how would we do it? If you could devise a program, what would it look like? And we'll hear from all the witnesses.
Perhaps I'll start. I would say that from my own perspective, the only conditions under which I would support research in a foreign country without an American collaborator is if, in fact, it was something we really needed to know and we were confident that it was something that was not going to happen in the United States.
Let's assume we have a U.S. collaborator
right.
then.
So when we have a U.S. collaborator, often, particularly in developing countries, the foreign collaborator can't afford to provide the resources for their part of the research. If we're serious about fostering collaboration, and if we have a serious motivation towards helping in infrastructure development in other countries, particularly in the developing world, then I think we have an obligation to provide at least minimal support. A big issue, however, in the diplomacy aspect of this is to make sure that these are not just one-shot, one-year investments. If we're serious about building infrastructure, we have to be willing to sustain it and maintain it at least for a while over time.
Very good point.
Well, I agree with Alan's points, but let me add that in my capacity with the National Academy of Sciences, I travel around the world very frequently and meet with the leadership of science of most of the countries of the world, and it is remarkable the number who have had experiences in the United States. Most of them speak English. They know our culture much better than we know theirs. They're very good interpreters of our society in their own environments. They're our friends. Typically, they desire to collaborate with us. This is a huge investment that that began after World War II and continued up until the late 80s, but after that has declined substantially. These assets will not be there. This generation is passing from the scene. We will not have the kinds of contacts and people who are familiar with our scientific institutions and our society more broadly in the leadership of science internationally in the future. So I would urge that one important step is to begin to reestablish the support for international graduate studies from developing countries, not from the developed countries, but from developing countries, where we can continue to benefit from this personal exchange.
Dr. Wulf?
Several points I'd like to make. First of all, the issue of funding foreign scientists to do research in their own countries is what CRDF does. Funded by NSF, the State Department, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, NIH. The original goal was to fund foreign scientists. This is something that an NGO can do. It's not so easy for the federal government to do. Second, I'd like to amplify just a little bit on your comment about visas in two dimensions. First of all, I think all of us sitting at this table travel a good deal overseas. And a common reaction that I get from my colleagues overseas is, what are you doing? We are shooting ourselves in the foot. Although I know that the average time it takes for a student visa to clear has gone from several months down to less than 2 weeks. That's not the story that plays on the front page of the newspapers overseas. It's the rare but newsworthy case where it takes 6 months, or we deny a visa to a renowned scientist or whatever. But second, there's a second problem, and that's the problem of deemed exports. I had the privilege of serving on a Department of Commerce committee to look at the question of deemed exports. But unless something changes, we could wind up in a situation in which no foreign student is allowed to do any research at a university in the United States. It is a very serious problem. Our committee submitted its report to the Secretary of Commerce back in late December or January. I think they have been working on it, but there may be legislative action that is required as well. And so I would urge you to think about that. And finally, I would like to just reiterate some of what Mike said about the goodwill that we have engendered overseas because of the foreign students who've been here. Mike and I were both in Iran in October, and it's just hard to explain how much the faculty at places like Sharif University, which is sort of their MIT, like Americans, understand our values, admire our values, and are some of the best ambassadors that we have in the entire world. So this is gold.
Dr. Calvin?
I think many of the points have already been mentioned, so I don't want to duplicate them, but two things I think are important to recognize is one, not all countries we want to engage in national partnerships are the same. And so a model that may work well in many of the developing countries isn't necessarily the right model to engage China, for example. And so I think we need to come up with a broader perspective on the issue of how we approach the problem. And second, I think it's important from a scientific standpoint that we need to have a funding model so the money goes where it needs to go to get the science done. And if that's in one location or the other, it shouldn't be the issue. Is the science getting done, and is the effective partnership in place to make that science work appropriately? And if we pay attention about quotas on one side or the other, we eventually find that there's inefficiencies in the system that doesn't allow us to get as much bang for our buck as we would like.
Dr. Calvin, I'll close with one comment and then recognize Dr. Ehlers, and that is that Dr. Clegg, you mentioned and others mentioned the importance of Mideast applications of scientific diplomacy. One of the things I would hope we would also do, I think it's absolutely correct that our technological and scientific prowess is admired by Middle Eastern nations. I would hope we could also look at science diplomacy as leading to our recognition of the scientific history and contributions of Middle Eastern nations. One need only look at some of the early astrolabes created by Islamic scientists to realize that we owe a profound debt. Algebra, zero, a few other things.
Absolutely.
And we need to accentuate that awareness within our own culture, I think, as well. With that, I recognize Dr. Ehlers.
First of all, I want to clarify that they hijacked that from India and from the Far East, too. So a lot of it was transmission of knowledge, not necessarily the discovery of it.
That was not me, by the way.
The chair recognizes Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you. It just struck me when you said they gave us zero. They give us zero and we give them nothing. and we think it's a fair exchange. Thank you very much for your testimony. It's been very, very enlightening to me. And I spent a year in Germany many years ago as a postdoctoral fellow supported by NATO. And I thought that was a marvelous program, especially to have some of our military money funneled into a good program like that. But also later on, my research advisor, Bill Nuremberg, some of you know him, brilliant physicist, lots of energy, but also a good diplomat. He was appointed by the Department of State as the representative to NATO on the science level. And we did those things much more often back then. I think we certainly have to return to that, and we have to correct the visa problem. But I'm very impressed, Bill, with the program you outlined, and I didn't know much about it, and I'm pleased to hear about what you're doing. It's a very good way to do it. One thing we did at Berkeley when I was on the faculty there, we took some students from Turkey and had them in our labs for a few years. And then one of our faculty members, one of my colleagues, spent some time in Turkey. And it was a marvelous experience because it made us realize how difficult it is to do research in a foreign country. And when my colleague was over there, almost every day I'd get a telephone call. Can you send me 3 O-rings of such and such a size? It really was that bad. And we don't appreciate that enough. And I think having their students come here and having our students or professors go there is really good in helping break the logjam in that. Some of the horror stories that I've heard from foreign scientists I've worked with. One ordered a marvelous new piece of equipment. This was many years ago, before bubble wrap and all those sort of things. It was packaged in a box with not foam insulation, but this microlight insulation and paper. The customs official just sliced that open, filled the scientific equipment with all these little particles, and took him 6 months to clean it out. It's just endless problems to be dealt with. I'm just very pleased with what you've said and what the progress I see. But I think we ought to work very hard at breaking down some of these barriers. And the first time I encountered it when I got here, I was asked to write this brief little booklet on science policy. And one of the goals, I think I developed it with the assistance of the National Academy, was to get a scientist back in the State Department. Why that ever stopped, I don't know. But the difficulty of getting it restarted just amazed me. It seemed to me a self-evident thing. Fortunately, it's underway now. We have so much work to do in so many areas on this topic, and I'm just glad you're there doing it. I don't really have questions. I just wanted to say I'm very pleased with what you're doing. And keep it up. And if there are things that we can do to help, please let us know. The visa question Dr. Baird has done a great job on addressing that, but we know there are a lot of other issues we should be addressing. I'd like to see a lot more exchange programs, not just the current situation where some students come here if they get the money and we send some people there, but an organized program, constant exchange, as we used to do with the Soviet Union. I think I have time left, but I will set a standard for everyone. Be the first one to close before the bell goes off. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I do want to thank you for pulling this together. It's a very important subject. And, you know, as important as it is for the development of science and technology, it's also, as you've mentioned, critical for just understanding and international issues. I think science is the tool we can use to open up these barriers. And so I really encourage you and your colleagues to continue. I have a couple of questions. First of all, how interested do you see multinational corporations being in developing an infrastructure for international scientific cooperation and collaboration?
CRDF has experienced substantial financial support from multinational corporations, both for research projects and also for education. GE, 3M, they're about.
Is there particular sectors that you think are more interested, or particular sectors interested?
The energy sector has been very interested. Well, the high-tech sector, I mean, it's an embarrassment that we are now a net importer of high-tech products. But yes.
I'd just echo what Bill says. There is great interest because of the perception that markets are largely going to grow abroad and not in the United States. And so American high-tech industries have a strong interest in developing relationships abroad, but their interests are largely driven by their business models and a need to deliver to their stockholders. They aren't as interested, I think, in the long-term issues that we have tried to portray in our presentations.
Do you think that the standards of ethics and integrity are an important issue for scientific development in countries that have different cultures than us? I guess is the way to say that.
Sure, and more we're seeing evidence that as the global scientific enterprise becomes more unified, more integrated, we are seeing more and more efforts among countries to have those kinds of discussions very candidly. We have participated in an array of them, including with China, who has invested a tremendous amount of effort in trying to develop their own set of standards and regulations and have them be in keeping with the rest of the world. But it's an effort that has begun and needs to continue. I'm sure that the Academies and the Inter-Academy panel have worked on these issues as well.
And let me just pick up on what Alan has said, and also to relate it back to a comment that Bill made. As Bill mentioned, we have a program of workshops with Iran, which are conducted on an annual basis. One of the first workshops that the Iranians wanted to have was on scientific ethics. But I'd like to also return in the context of ethics to a broader point, which is that science does operate within an ethical framework, because you cannot do science without paying attention to the material evidence. And science has to be repeatable so that it has to be honest. So there's an ethical basis to science which adds, we believe, to the temper of society, and therefore helping expand science and technology capabilities in other parts of the world also expands an ethical basis, which is an important dimension of science.
Thank you. I'm not sure who to ask this question, who to direct this question to. What do you think the limiting factors are in promoting global scientific cooperation and collaboration? What are the ultimate limiting factors? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it cultural? Or is it something else that I haven't mentioned?
Well, my experience is that, and of course this is coming from a single institution, but there's no limitation in scientists' interest or willingness, as long as the research is available to public peer-reviewed processes, to find new partners and engage in new collaborations. What's limiting is mechanisms to provide introductions to those individuals, and then the model, so that if you can instigate a new partnership, you can actually follow through on your relationship. As it stands right now, if I have a colleague in another country, we have to go to separate funding mechanisms under separate funding cycles, and hoping that we can make a case for something that's of interest to two non-coordinated bodies to be able to push forward from an initial process. So it's this coordination of communication, and then a model that appreciates
You're saying
partnership.
it's kind of what you see as a bureaucracy. The bureaucratic hassle is one of the biggest factors then.
I guess if you want to put it that way,
Yeah.
I've always put it, there's always, resources always become an issue at some point.
Well,
But,
of course.
but faculty members at our institution are aware of what's going on worldwide. And if they have a collaborator that's anywhere in the world, they know how to get a hold of them, and they have the international conferences to make the introductions. But they don't have is the mechanism to take that next step.
One of the things, if I might just mention, is that the European Commission opened its Framework 7 competition to people outside of the European Union, and we met with the Argentine science minister last week, who very proudly pointed out the extent of Argentina's participation in Framework 7. Well, that's not only a form of science diplomacy, but it's certainly a mechanism that makes it a whole lot easier to develop international cooperation, and it's part of the reason that I am obsessed with the notion that we need to rethink the way in which we structure our own funding for.
Thank you.
I can't not say that resources are also a limiting factor, which you didn't mention. I've been really impressed by the fact that CRDF's average grant to support foreign scientists and collaboration between foreign scientists and U.S. scientists is $60,000 over 2 years. 80% of that money goes to the foreign scientists, 20% to the U.S. That's a tiny, tiny little bit of money, and yet we have no problem finding U.S. scientists who want to participate. They do it because they think it's important, because they think it's a contribution that they can make to the world. That's not the limitation. Money is.
Speaking of limitations, I think I've run over my time a little bit, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back.
Fortunately, Mr. Ehlers had pre-yielded time. He established a time bank that Mr. McNerney drew upon.
I may reclaim that.
Mr. Bilbray.
Yes, Mr. Calvin, you want to be frustrated about uncoordinated efforts, you should try to work with the Senate. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I wasn't going to mention anything about the visa, but it really is a very important issue, and I hope that today we can sort of understand that the Science Committee ought to be an advocate, but understand that the obstructionism that is caused at the visa process is not the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. Now, we all have heard back and forth the 9/11 terrorists were visa overstays, and we assume that the concept of checking like visa status whenever you let somebody into an educational institution is not the business of educational institutions. But then again, you had the 9/11 terrorists take a class in aviation and use it, and that's one of the problems. And so I just hope that this chairman of this committee becomes be a perfect spokesman for the fact that our problem is that we're trying to do it all at the border. You know, we're trying to restrict those who come into our country, and what happens is the bureaucrat who's making these calls has a feeling that once I say okay, there is nothing to back me up afterwards. 40% of the people illegally in this country are visa overstays, and to a lot of people their argument is the way you eliminate 40% of the problem is just don't allow any visas. And I don't think any of us wants to do that. But I think that if we want to open up and make the system more rational, we've got to understand, we've got to stop taking the political easy route of saying let's do it all at the border, let's just not issue visas, or let's tighten up the visa process, rather than having a backup system so that the agent who is given the visa can be assured that, look, somebody might slip through, they might overstay, but at least I know then that somebody is checking that they can't get a driver's license, they can't open a bank account, they can't get a job, and then I feel you're going to see the visa system open up much more. But historically, we've not been brave enough to do, to address that. I mean, this week I think we're going to have a vote on e-verification. Very simple system, name and number matches. But even that, people don't want to take the political heat for, so it ends up being easier politically to put it all on the visa system. And I think that as a child of an immigrant, that is, and watching my cousins trying to get in this country, that is one thing that we've got to open up. But if we want it opened up, then we've got to be willing to take the heat at having a backup system. And that means doing these checks and in-depth to be able to assure the visa application handler you're not the only barrier between the American people and somebody who may come into the country or stay or overstay. But getting back to one of the things I'm interested in is the applicational, the use of water. I think one of the things we're missing is that water is going to be the most destabilizing element in the world in the future, more than oil, and especially from the Jordan to India, from the Kurdistan down to the sub-Saharan. I mean, that is really, and the Muslim world is one of the biggest crises. I'm very encouraged with your work of getting Israel and Jordan working together, because no one in the world has done more at conservation and application of water than Israel. Negev Desert research with high salinity, that really could have a great diplomatic advantage of moving science, but also getting two parts of that world working together. And as somebody who's worked for 25 years, since I was 25 years old, working with Mexico on environmental and economic issues, that's how you build relationships, is working at joint problems together. And can you elaborate on how you got Jordan and Israel working together?
Well, actually, it was Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. We initially approached the parties to work on a scientific project of high importance as a bridge-building mechanism to create understanding between the scientists in that conflicted region of the world. The initial focus was actually on health, but during the process, the issue of water in the Jordan Valley, which is a very contentious and difficult political issue, came to the fore as one of the primary issues. So a committee of scientists representing all three entities, including also the United States, was put together under our sponsorship. We provided the money for the work and so forth, and that led to a book-length report that I cited in my written testimony called Water for the Future. This effort, which is slow, this kind of work is not easy because it means building trust and relationships among people where there is very little trust to begin with. That, however, has matured into a number of efforts on our part to work together with those three parties, including something called the Frontiers of Science for young and mid-career scientists of the Middle East, which we've hosted twice now, once in Istanbul and most recently in Spain. This brings young and mid-career scientists together for symposia on five quite distinct areas of science to build relationships and understanding. We also just had a meeting in January in Jordan on the Dead Sea with Palestine, Israel, and Jordan to focus on other areas of science that we can work on. Among them are micronutrient deficiencies, which is a serious health problem in the Middle East, land degradation and pollution, water resources, education. But that takes resources, and virtually all of the support for these kinds of activities has come from private sources, either philanthropic sources or from our own institutional endowment. So what we can do is fairly limited. And so this allows me to come back to this question of resources. You cannot do things without adequate resources, no matter how good your intentions are. Resources are important. The other key thing is that science can be an essential component of soft diplomacy and can help solve problems in all parts of the world. I'd like to just say a word about our part of the world. Our activities also include Latin America. You cited Mexico. We did a joint study on water and the water issues facing the basin of the Valley of Mexico, Mexico City, together with the Mexican Academy of Sciences, which has been influential in that country. We do continued water work in Mexico. I just came from Central America on Sunday night. It is a disappointment to see that our national engagement in soft diplomacy in Central America is very little. And
Doctor, I totally agree with you. We've totally ignored Central America. We spend more time on in Argentina than we do in Costa Rica or El Salvador.
Right. The Northern Europeans make bigger investments in science and technology diplomacy in Central America than does the United States, despite the fact that this is a region of vital interest to us. So I'll stop talking.
You and I will talk about that later.
We'll begin a second round of comments and questions. Dr. Calvin, you were building kind of a line of thought earlier, it seemed like, and at the critical juncture paused and talked about, okay, so you've got U.S. researchers, foreign researchers, and I think you used the word, there's a lack of a mechanism or some word like that. What would a mechanism look like? How would it be administered? What would you do if you want to promote scientific diplomacy, international collaboration? What would it look like?
Well, I think, again, as I said before, it would depend somewhat on which area of the globe I was trying to promote this effort. But I think that if you take, for example, in China, where we've had our 3 China-U.S. summits, what we've come out of this is that we have a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. We bring scientists together. Everybody's excited. And then after 3 conferences, we're still at the same stage because no one can find a good model to really move the projects to that next stage of discovery. And so I think in the case of China, there is quite a reason to believe that we could work with the Chinese government to establish a jointly funded research capability that would allow investigators to apply to an agency that would be financed by both countries potentially. I don't believe that we would want to make an argument that we would want to change the dedication of the existing resources at the National Science Foundation, for example, because they are woefully underfunded from my perspective as they sit right now, and asking more and giving them less isn't a way to do anything better. But beyond that, I don't have an effective mechanism, because I'm sure that the political aspects associated with getting anything through the channels of dialogue are far beyond my experiences, and I couldn't advocate in an area where I have so little expertise.
Things I found intriguing was, we've looked at some of the S&T agreements between the state has established. I think you said 130 MOAs. I think that's more than our government officially has with our other. I don't mean that as a critical comment, more just it's intriguing that the university entity may have more international agreements than the federal government, and the administration of these things at our challenge that relatively small staff tasked with creating these agreements, but the follow-up then becomes a problem. Share an anecdote with you and then ask I want to pursue this issue of funding further and how we get around it or deal with it. My wife, who does international development work, was in an African country, and they were talking about the relative small number of people some developing countries have who are expertise. In this particular African country, they had 3 water sanitation experts, one of whom died of AIDS, and the two others were killed in a car wreck coming back from his funeral. And that was it. You know, in our country, you'd just post an ad and you'd get 50 applications and you'd replace them. That was the entire country's water sanitation unit. This issue of capacity building is really critical. And one of the interesting questions I have, Dr. Wulf, your agent or organization seems to be able to get money to foreign researchers, and yet other government, U.S. government, well, not other U.S. government entities, but U.S. government entities, take away the word other, seem not to be able to do that. Is this a desirable mechanism? Are there better alternatives? You know, I mean, one of my questions is does it make sense, for example, for state or USAID to have a fund that, while we don't dilute the NSF funds, as Dr. Calvin, I think I agree entirely with what he's saying, but nevertheless an NSF-funded researcher could say, okay, I want to collaborate with Dr. so-and-so in foreign country X, here's where we'll go, and everybody knows this is where you go. So I'd throw that question out.
My understanding is that there are legal restrictions on NSF providing money to foreign researchers. I don't quite understand how this works, but they seem to be able to fund CRDF to fund foreign researchers. So, okay. Actually, I think there's some advantages other than legal sleight of hand going on here. Because, for example, CRDF can negotiate with foreign governments for cost-sharing arrangements. That's something that NSF, or I think any federal agency, cannot do. And we've been fairly successful at that. The foreign governments clearly recognize the advantage of these collaborations and have demonstrated that with $43 million of cost sharing.
Let me follow up with just a question on this. You know, USAID, I think, and I actually support it, has made a real effort to brand. I mean, they've actually gone over the top a little bit. I think if you gave toothpicks, you'd have to find a way on a toothpick, you know, a gift to the American people on this toothpick. But nevertheless, the idea that in some way, when we spend U.S. dollars internationally on an aid project, people get the sense that, yeah, this is U.S. dollars, is a good thing for us. Our generosity should be recognized, I think. How does that translate into the work CRDF does?
I think foreign nationals recognize that CRDF is a U.S. entity, just not the U.S. government. And that, again, is somewhat of an advantage in places where the intentions of the U.S. government are not necessarily trusted. So,
Dr. Leshner, you look like you wanted to comment on.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate the last comment that Dr. Wulf made, which is that often it's important to go through a third party or a non-governmental organization so that the sort of neutrality of the motivation is clear. Was that English, what I just said? It was an attempt at English. Yes, thank you. And I think because science carries this sort of aura around it, it's often important to make clear that the act of science diplomacy, either collaboration or for more general relationship building, is going on outside of a formal governmental framework.
With respect to Africa, I'd like to say a couple of things. The first is that the U.S. philanthropic community has created a large footprint in Africa. The Gates Foundation does support direct research in Africa. It's a very large and very significant player, as you know. There is also the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa, which is funded by 6 of the major American philanthropic foundations. So the philanthropic community is a very important player in the creation of soft diplomacy for the United States, even though it's not part of the government. It is possible to leverage some of those activities, and it would be useful for the government to think through how it might leverage and take advantage of the good work being done by American institutions in other contexts. Another point is that we, together with the science academies of the whole world, have created a global organization. One of the messages that that global organization has tried to get across to all of the national members is that investments in human resources and science and technology capabilities within individual countries is an absolute necessity if they expect to participate in the economies of the 21st century. And that's a local responsibility. We cannot assume that responsibility, but we can work hard to try and get that message across, and also to facilitate their movement in that direction through incentives.
Dr. Ehlers is recognized for 9.5 minutes.
At least. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, a couple of points. Getting to the question of our government supporting other scientists in other countries or doing other things. I had an experience in my family. My son is a geophysicist, and I never realized before he became that how much they travel. At the moment, he's in Bolivia doing some very esoteric experiments in rather dangerous territory. And he's also done research in British Columbia, about 300 miles from the nearest person. He had a commitment from a colleague in Germany to do some research together. The colleague obtained funds from the German government to do it if the U.S. would provide the money. My son submitted a grant proposal, could not get any money from the federal government to match a project with the German. That seems a bit strange to me. And of course, my personal ethics didn't allow me to intervene on his behalf, but I thought that was symptomatic of a real problem here. The issue of resources, Dr. Clegg, you mentioned that a number of times, the resources in other countries. Are you talking about money or a lot of other resources? Because I gave the example of my friend was needing 3 O-rings and things like that in a relatively advanced country. I think that's a major problem, judging from the foreign scientists I've worked with, just getting equipment. And I'm not talking about getting money from the government to order equipment from the U.S., but I'm talking the mundane equipment that one needs every day in the laboratory. Have you encountered that as a major?
Oh, absolutely, particularly in travels in the developing world, in Latin America, in parts of Africa, where the ability to put together a functional laboratory is inhibited by the lack of access and also the lack of maintenance for high-quality scientific equipment. That's a very big issue. Typically, when we say resources, we're talking money, one way or the other. It's a nice way of saying money, but there are other resources which are absolutely crucial. One is access to the world's scientific literature. You cannot be, as you very well know, an effective practicing scientist without access to the contemporary development of knowledge in a field. And the transforming technology of our era is electronic communication. It is now possible to access knowledge almost from anywhere in the world. There are just 2 barriers. One barrier is infrastructure, whether the people and the scientists in a particular country have the infrastructure to get on the web and access the scientific literature, and the other is intellectual property issues associated with publishers like my friend Alan, being able to access the scientific literature. There are places where the U.S. government could be of direct help, creating digital scientific libraries where resources, again, were provided to buy site licenses that would allow people in poor countries to access the scientific literature. And we have worked together on programs in limited areas in that context. One is Pakistan, where we found that we could purchase bundled site licenses at a huge discount. So it is possible to do those sorts of things.
Alan?
There is a large consortium called Hinari that provides free access to the world's scientific literature to a very large number of countries in the developing world that most major journals participate in. The point I wanted to add is the other, and it may be resources, but it may not only be resources, is scientific careers. That is, that it has to be clear that there is a career path in a developing country, that it's not just going to be a momentary opportunity, or you won't be able to recruit the best and brightest into careers. Many countries now are working very hard and investing very hard to bring the scientists who trained in the United States back home by providing career opportunities, and it's very effective. China, of course, is the best example of that at the moment, but other countries are doing this as well.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, this is a cliche, forgive me, but Churchill is supposed to have made the comment that America always does the right thing after they've done all the other things first. It seems to me that we're at a state where we should think seriously about doing this as a national effort in a coordinated way instead of having all the different organizations doing this. And there's tremendous opportunities there. But I wouldn't dare to put this in the State Department because they don't seem to understand the problem and the urgency. Are we going to give it the charge to the National Science Foundation to do that? Not without increasing their budget substantially. But we really have to think seriously about developing mechanisms rather than depending on the private sector or the National Academy, the universities, or whatever. There's immense international relations work to be done here, and the federal government is just not doing it. It's depending on you folks to do it, and that's not the most efficient way to get it done. So I hope we can pursue this idea together in some way.
Can I reinforce that? Just in my travels around the world in the last 10 years, I feel we're at a moment in time where this kind of activity could have an enormous impact, a positive impact on U.S. foreign policy and U.S. hopes for democratizing the rest of the world. We've just got an opportunity, and it's very frustrating that we're limited in being able to take advantage of that opportunity.
Well, that's very true, and you know, these things happen in a haphazard way. I had a constituent come to me a couple of years ago. They had a great idea for a new water filter. It's made out of concrete with sand in it, et cetera, et cetera. And he had backing of the Rotary Club. He wondered what I could do for him through the government. I said, not much. But I did put him in touch with a friend who works regularly in Africa as part of our religious denomination. And then there's another friend of mine who operates a plastic extrusion plant, so he replaced the concrete with plastic. It's producing these things at very low cost, easy to ship to Africa. We're saving an incredible number of lives just with this simple local project, which results in purified water on a per family or per community basis. It's amazing, and just a few people getting together. That's without the benefit of the government. Now, maybe it's best that we don't have the government involved. It would increase the cost and the difficulty. But nevertheless, we're missing, as a nation, we're missing all these opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers. The points you raise is really the purpose of the hearings. With this whole series of hearings is to try to understand how, from many perspectives, what is being done, and then see what we can do in an improved way. And so this is part of that, and I agree that we want to raise the profile, and that's indeed why. We mentioned earlier, we've now been joined by Mr. Carnahan, and we mentioned earlier the role Russ was discussed, the importance of the Foreign Relations Committee. Russ plays a central role because he has a joint assignment both to this committee and to Foreign Relations. And so welcome, Mr. Carnahan. Do you have any questions for our witnesses? Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and again, apologize for being late today. I got tied up on something else, but wanted to make a special point to be here. I guess I wanted to first start with kind of a broad question, and we may have covered some of this, but as we know, Department of State is chiefly responsible for our diplomatic relations and engagement. And I guess I'd want a description from you of how they're using the role of science in diplomacy now in ways that you think is working. What do you think is working best about that? And then also, what do you think is some of the obvious things that they're missing in terms of how it can be better integrated in what they do?
Well, there are a couple of examples immediately come to mind. One is in a partnership with the Department of State, led by Paula Dobriansky, we organized a meeting on women in science and engineering in the Muslim world. And that was an extremely effective example of science diplomacy at its best, where 200 women from, I believe, 30-some countries participated in that meeting. Recently, our Chief International Officer, Von Tarikian, just came back from a meeting in Uruguay to start talking about some of the collaborations that an organization like AAAS might be able to help facilitate. So there are examples. I think that an issue that did come up earlier is an important one, and that is that the way in which these activities are initiated and maintained is critically important. And often to have a non-governmental organization as a clear partner can help lend neutrality, whatever the word is, to clearer motivation to it, so that it's not just implementing a particular political agenda, but also has scientific motivation as well.
Just to add a tiny bit from, actually, in my written testimony was a comment on the May 2007 strategic plan that the Department of State had developed on setting international goals for their science, technology, and health diplomacy. We think those are a very good set of goals. I think our major concern is that whether they have the resources and capabilities to implement them. So being able to reach out to other organizations like those represented at this table as partners in implementing those goals may be helpful. The only other comment is that often the science technology capabilities at the embassy level in U.S. missions abroad is fairly limited, and that's a disadvantage. It's, again, a resource-driven question, but it is a disadvantage to U.S. diplomacy because it makes it more difficult for us to understand and interpret S&T strengths and developments in the countries that we are engaged with.
I would second the last comment that Mike made. Over the last several decades, the number of science attaches in foreign embassies has dramatically dropped. The emphasis in most of the State Department now is on political and economic issues. It is a positive thing that there now is a science advisor to the Secretary of State. We have a particularly good person, Nina Fedorov, in that position now. But as currently structured and to some extent as currently culturally oriented, the State Department is not particularly good at implementing the kinds of things that we've been talking about this morning. It's why they use us, and I think appropriately so.
I think the only thing I need to add on this is that when I talk about science and diplomacy, the first observation that comes to mind is always that the scientific timescale for success and the political timescale for interest often don't match. And it's a major commitment for people to reshift their careers to certain areas of emphasis, and they're very hesitant to do so, given some past experiences in the high energy physics arena, for example, to make these leaps of faith if they can't believe that their career will be able to be supported once they make that transition.
Good point. I appreciate all of those. One thing in particular I wanted to mention that was on a recent delegation trip that included a stop in India, where they had announced a very large expansion of the Fulbright program there, and it was done in a unique way that was really opening it up to public and private funding in a way to dramatically expand what they're doing there. And so it was a neat kind of local initiative, what they're doing right there through the, organized through the embassy there. That might be a good model to look at growing those kind of programs in other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I think we're talking about is the challenges out there, and someone will bring it up. I think, Mr. Chairman, while we face the challenges, we need to sort of look at great opportunities. I think that we use the term World Wide Web and don't think about how deep it really does run. I mean, everybody's astonished they can go to Kuwait and get on the internet. Mr. Chairman, I think any of us that have spent time in the third world, when you go back into the villages and some of the poorest neighborhoods, some grandmother has figured out how to pick up 2 or 3 old computers, and the number one source of communication between countries now in third world countries are not telephones, not mail, it's the internet. So I think this issue of the accessibility of third world nations having, or the accessibility to the world information is something that really is a great opportunity if we can figure out how to tear those barriers down. And it's just astonished me as I travel in the third world when I get back there. If I need to communicate with my staff, I don't make phone calls. I get on the internet and just figure out how to pay, 15 whatever to a little old lady so I can spend 15 minutes to communicate. Just let my staff know they still have a job. Building on that, let me just sort of go a whole different way. Mr. Calvin, we were looking at the comment of Central America. I mean, how many Americans realize that we're 400 miles farther away from San Diego, where we sit now, Mr. Chairman, than where we are from Central America? That it is right in our backyard. And I would just say this to somebody in the Foreign Relations Committee. Maybe the Science Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee really need to get together and say, the poor stepchild is Central America. We talk about South America, we talk about Mexico, but Central America is just literally a diplomatic black hole for us in so many ways. And Mr. Calvin, you've talked about Latin America. Is there any specific items that you can point out? Panama is a good example. But between, we're talking about some of the poorest people right in our backyard. It's going to have more effect on our children, our grandchildren's future than any other. What are we doing in Central America?
Well, I guess I'll take a sort of a circuitous route to get to your answer. Our relationship with Mexico have been very effective for a couple of reasons. Clearly, the proximity between Texas and Mexico is certainly an advantage. But also because of the border governors initiatives and other activities that are taking place, there's a recognition that these scientific exchanges can also produce economic development benefits that can help the stability of the relationship between the Texas and Mexico. But Mexico has a size advantage. And when you take the relationship we have with Mexico and you talk to people, Senaseat has come and visited us from Panama because they want to put a duplicate relationship together that Conaseat developed in Mexico. And the difficulty is the size of the capacity that exists in Panama or these other countries. It's very difficult to duplicate because we've got Texas A&M University and 40 universities in Mexico. We have Texas A&M University and maybe over 2 or 3 universities in Mexico, and in Panama, and many of them, their researchers are not really trained to be globally competitive in research, and so their interests are in upgrading their capacity to be able to become partners with the global environment in a competitive research arena. So we're trying to figure out how to partner with distinct political groups in a global area, because each of them doesn't really have enough capacity to work with as effectively individually as Mexico.
Well, that is why, like last month, we met with the Mexican. The southern parts of Mexico have not gained from any of the exchanges. They are economic and cul-de-sacs. But Central America, which was once a united country, still has its immigration policy as the United States of Central America. We need to address those comprehensively to get them used to working together. But the experience, I'd be interested in the experience you had in Central America and your observations and the challenges go there, because we've got a whole lot of scientific research. I'm already seeing Scripps Institute looking at Central America for the development of biofuels. And the infrastructure is traditionally not there, but the attitude towards the United States is so positive right now. I worry about us looking, and no offense, Mr. Chairman, looking to Africa and Asia while we overlook our neighbors. And if you could address that.
Well, I think you're making a very, very important point. Much of Central America is extremely poor. Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica is a bit better. And the question is, why does Costa Rica stand out? And the reason is that they have invested a lot more in education and tried to build an economy focused on the comparative advantages that Costa Rica has, particularly in an environmental context. But in Nicaragua, for example, 50% of the population is illiterate. I've had experiences in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua in my duties representing the Academy. One of the things that is going to be key for them to move forward in their own development is to make more investments in education. But those, to some extent, are local responsibilities. There are things that we can help with by providing incentives, but they're not things we can do for them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just add something here? This is about Venezuela, which is not quite Central America, but almost. I had a fascinating experience in January. I was privileged to be inducted into the National Academy of Sciences in Venezuela. I went down there with some trepidation, given the bellicose tone of exchanges between our two governments. And what I found was exactly what we were talking about in this hearing, namely the ability of scientists and engineers, because of their shared values, because of their frequent training in the United States, to communicate. I think we have an enormous opportunity to turn the situation around with Venezuela, and the opening is through scientists and engineers. I think this is globally true, but it was just such a forceful personal experience.
Well, historically in Latin America, academia as a whole has not been politically threatening. And so the political structure has allowed academia to do trans-border communication that traditionally they would not allow any other institution to do. So we do have the opportunity, if they're willing to allow academia and scientists to cooperate and work without direct supervision by government, where other institutions would not be allowed to do it.
And this is a perfect example of where using NGOs doesn't introduce the complication of government-to-government interaction.
Just to follow up on, I just returned from a meeting of the Network of Academies of Science for this hemisphere, which was held in Central America this weekend. We have a very effective organization that could do much, much more in that network of science academies, and it tries to address three questions. One is the problem of education in the hemisphere. The second is water resource issues in the hemisphere. So we have the means to do much more. We have built the relationships. We also command respect among our peers in that part of the world because we try to work together with them. But what we are able to do at the moment is limited once again by our resource capabilities.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbray. I think your points are well taken about relative neglect of our own hemisphere. I know well, having flown to Guatemala once and get off the airplane, I thought I wouldn't be back home in Vancouver, Washington yet. I'm already in Guatemala. We forget that. I thank the witnesses for not only your outstanding and insightful testimony, both verbal and written today, but your many years of service, each and every one of you. The record of this committee will remain open for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions. We thank the witnesses, the audience, and the members of the committee, and with that, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In fact, we do have a biological center.
Yeah,
reporting up in Costa Rica.
yeah, we did.